Welcome to the Bestiary, where every episode we examine another monster from the Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual. Join us at Alignment May Vary on Twitch, or listen to our podcast, which comes out a week later on alignmentmayvary.com. Ask and get your questions answered on our Facebook page, or by sending us an email to alignmentmayvary@gmail.com. Enjoy the show.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Bestiary. My name is Morgan, and I'm going to be running the Twitch side of things while we do this. Apologies for the late start. We had some technical difficulties. I'm going to turn you over to John now. John, hello.
Hello. Good to see everybody again. Today, we're really excited. We have a guest star with us. First, I'll introduce myself, Jonathan Stark, the DM who usually kills the party. And we've got Kayvon with us, Kayvon Barami.
Hello.
And this time we have a wonderful guest star. It's my pleasure to introduce, you'll be hearing his voice, not a visual, but I will introduce the voice of Ari Marmell, who is a writer of things that keep a smile on my face for a long time. He's, in his writing, done some pretty cool stuff. He has eroded and ended timelines, such as when he wrote Gehenna, the Final Night for the Vampire the Masquerade game. He mixed fantasy and noir in his Mick Oberon series. And he created the most memorable band of goblins that I've ever encountered in the Goblin Corps, as well as other things. I'm currently reading his Ash and Ambition, which is fantastic. And I'd like to introduce Ari Marmell.
Hello, this is Ari Marmell, and I've written things that apparently Jonathan likes.
And you've also chosen the Mind Flayer as your monster of the day here. Could you tell us what a Mind Flayer is?
So a Mind Flayer is a humanoid abomination, tall, gaunt, purple, slimy. It is equipped with numerous tentacles on its face, which it uses to consume the brains of those it has psionically stunned, or it chooses to control them as near mindless thralls.
Nice.
But it's unhappy making, is what it is.
Unhappy making.
Yeah, the unhappy makers of D&D.
I like it.
I am going to apologize in advance. I am talking to you from Austin, Texas, where the allergens are 80% of the oxygen. So if I cough on the microphone regularly, it's not the company.
Good to know.
I want to move on to why you chose the Mind Flayer, Ari.
It is a combination of the fact that I really like sinister, behind-the-scenes manipulators and masterminds. I really like Lovecraftian influence in fantasy. And I really feel like most people, including most D&D writers, use the Mind Flayer wrong.
I'm really, really interested in that. When you say they use it wrong, what do you mean?
And I mean, I have to give the usual caveat, that obviously whatever works for your game works for your game. I'm actually going to illustrate the point by actually starting with a bit of an aside on a different monster, which is talking about the Drow for just a minute. The Drow are everywhere in D&D these days. We know the intricate ins and outs of their society, of their major cities. They star in approximately 98% of D&D fiction.
Yep.
And a lot of people either don't know or have forgotten that when they first appeared way back in the early days in the Against the Giants series, they were a huge unknown. They were a mystery. They were the behind-the-scenes masterminds that nobody knew a thing about.
So it's kind of along the lines that they've lost their mystery.
Well, I mean that's the simple way to say it, but it's it's more than that, and it's understandable. People thought the Drow were really cool, so the writers both fiction and game expanded on them, which got more people interested, which people thought they were cooler. And then, of course, Drizzt Do'Urden came around, and he was a heroic character. And it's not just they've lost the mystery, it's that because, that's, you can have good villains that aren't mysterious, where there comes a point where, for good or for ill, we got to know them so well that they were, I'm going to get jumped on by fans for using this term, and I apologize, they're mundane.
Do you think that came about? I know we won't spend all of our time on the Drow, but do you think this started because the Drow were introduced as this sort of like, they may be real, they may not, and then there was this big reveal, like they're real and they're underneath you and they're coming up and you're all in danger forever. Mm-hmm. Like, would there have been a way to, after that explosion of character, to like make them mysterious again?
I think there would have been a way to draw it out a little longer, but I mean, no, with their popularity, they were going to see more and more use. They were going to see more and more detail. And that's not inherently a bad thing in general.
Well, I think I kind of agree, because it's the problem I have with why I don't want to play human characters in D&D and why I want to stay away from elves, because they are everywhere. I have so far picked characters that are lesser used races and lesser used classes for the most part, just because it is interesting and different and not something you see all the time. So that makes sense. And if you're taking that, and that's kind of why you've enjoyed the Mind Flayers as much as you do, because people don't seem to know as much about them, then I totally get you.
And here's where, I'm using the Drow example to get into this, but there's a fundamental difference as well. While it would be nice if they still had an element of that mystery, when I say they're mundane, you can still do all kinds of cool things with them, tell all kinds of cool stories with them. Because the Drow, for all that their society is evil and whatnot, the Drow are still mortal beings. They are quote-unquote normal creatures in D&D. It's not a problem that we've gotten inside their heads. And because, there are a lot of people, and I agree with this, who feel that at least when it comes to, and again, quote-unquote normal creatures, there shouldn't be such thing as automatically evil, automatically understanding. I don't believe that all orcs need or should be evil. All goblins should be evil, because that's an element.
Right.
That's an element of, if you'll forgive me for bringing in a little bit of a real world cultural issue, that's an element of othering that we can kind of do without anymore.
No, that's actually hits on something really key in D&D these days. I feel like the modern D&D has tried to move away from ideas of, race determines your alignment, which was very much a part of the early days.
Well, and the thing is, I think that for creatures like Drow, orcs, even creatures like dragons, I think that's a good thing. That said, I still think fantasy, when you start dealing with creatures that are not even otherworldly, but other planar, there is still some room for that. There is still room, and I think in our escapism, still need for a small selection of creatures that we can truly put forth as these are an evil to be defeated. It's one of my problems, as much as I like the setting in other respects, it's one of my problems with Planescape that they humanized the fiends to an extent.
Yeah, they kind of become goofy, don't they?
These are creatures that are supposed to be literally the embodiment of spiritual evil. They shouldn't be humanized.
Oh, but they're cute and cuddly now, right?
I feel like Mind Flayers and a few other aberrations serve that purpose coming from the Lovecraftian end of things as opposed to the demon and devil ends of things. One can easily take that too far. Lovecraft himself had some issues that got into his writing that we don't necessarily want in our modern fiction. So the problem the Mind Flayers have that the Drow don't is that when you lose the mysteries, the mystery behind the Mind Flayers, when you get into their heads, you're not just changing the role they play, like you did with the Drow. You're changing their innate nature as an adversary, as a creature.
Mm-hmm.
You can still use the Drow in all kinds of cool stories without the mystery and by making their motives comprehensible.
Yeah.
The Mind Flayers, I really feel, should never be comprehensible. That's not saying you can't know what they're doing. I don't have a problem with that, a lot of their backstory in different editions has had to do with, they're trying to rebuild their empire, or they're trying to blot out the sun. Those are objectives you can get your head around. Where I would like things to remain mysterious is exactly why they want this or what they're going to do once they succeed.
Well, now I got to ask, as a DM, then, is this kind of one of those things where there's almost like you don't feel we should use this creature, or like we should keep them in the background because, maybe knowing too much about them destroys the image? Like, how would you use them as a DM?
So there are two things that I would never say don't use them, because otherwise there's no point in them being in the game. Things that I tend to do with my own campaign, and this is not what I'm saying everybody should do, this is just an example of the kind of stuff I'm talking about, is that first of all, I always try to keep them behind the scenes initially. If a story involves the Mind Flayers, the PCs should never know, or should not know when it starts that it involves them. That should be a revelation of some sort.
So what do you think about the use of them as sort of, because I see them a lot in adventures pop up as sort of this like, oh, there's a Mind Flayer there, and then the party, kills it or moves on from it. Is this kind of like, this is the wrong way to use them?
I really try to play up the alien nature of it. For instance, I never have Mind Flayers speak directly to the PCs, and I try to even avoid having them telepathically communicate with the PCs. What I prefer to do is have the Mind Flayer and its minions, its humanoid thralls, in front of it, and the thralls speak for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that.
The goblin thrall might begin a sentence that the human thrall finishes. The creature is literally...
Yeah, Hive Mind, yeah.
Yeah. I try to portray them as not having an entire full comprehension of how normal creatures think or feel. In one of my more horrific games, I had the PCs walk into a cavern, and there was a couple of dozen people scattered throughout the cavern, just engaged in all sorts of, they were killing each other, eating each other, all of this going on in one big mass of flesh. And the Mind Flayers, they weren't doing this out of malice. They were hovering overhead and simply absorbing the feelings, the emotions.
This brings me to kind of I guess, first of all, I should explain a little bit for listeners some of the stuff that Ari is describing. The Mind Flayers are psionic. They're actually one of the first truly psionic creatures of D&D. And I think they were the impetus for them bringing psionic rules into the game. As early as 1975 is when the Mind Flayer first shows up. So they can get inside your head. Amongst some of the terrible things they're described as doing, the one that really freaked me out the most was, so they're brain eaters. They eat the brains of other creatures. We've talked about that a little bit. But they have this thing called feast sharing, where they will be eating the brain of a humanoid, and they'll create a psychic link between the humanoid and their taste buds so that the person whose brain they're eating can taste their brain as it's being devoured.
Yeah, that's a nope for me.
and I'm not saying that every game has to portray them exactly this way. I'm simply saying that I feel like a lot of the written material has failed to maintain the alienness of them. In some cases, the adventures, but there have been some elements of the fiction that involved Mind Flayers where they were really just treated like some other guy who happened to have a tentacly face.
Yeah, no, I've seen that. It's definitely not nearly as imposing.
There are those who are going to say, well, why do I have to use my Mind Flayers this way? And of course you don't have to. But the fact is, most of the monsters in D&D are comprehensible to some extent or another. So why would you take one of the very few that isn't and make it so? Why would you take it and then have him just be the scheming, power-hungry vizier behind the Drow, the Drow matron? Or, why would you write their society where they don't talk about a certain phase in their reproductive cycle because it's considered to be impolite? It just strikes me as a wasted opportunity. And, and I'm also aware of the fact that not all of this background goes back to the first appearances you were mentioning of the Mind Flayer back in, 75, or, a lot of the whole Far Realm or Time Displaced or other truly alien aspects, those came out in 2nd edition, 3rd edition.
Yeah, did you ever read the Ilithiad?
I did, but it was a long time ago.
And I'm just curious because I kind of want to know, like maybe I'll go down the group here, like Ari, Kayvon, Morganite, like which of the backgrounds to the Mind Flayer do you think is, you can say which one's canon, or you can say at least which one you find the most interesting. Because there's a lot of different historical kind of like, where did they come from? You've mentioned a few as we've talked, like one of the theories is they come from sort of the in-between realms and planes. One is that they literally come from a future, like the end times, and they went back in time. There's all these different theories. What's your favorite, Ari?
Of the ones that are written, as much as I'm a fan of the Far Realm, I like the coming from the end of the universe thing, the end of time. I have actually kind of combined those in my own headcanon, where they were so close to the end of time that things have begun to break down. So there was some Far Realm influence as well. But yeah, they came back in time to escape that.
I like that version as well, because I think it kind of makes the it sort of adds to the horror in that this is our future.
Plus, I really like, and this comes from I think this comes from the Lords of Madness book in 3rd edition. That's where they talked about the Mind Flayers and the Aboleth, who are also one of my favorite semi-Lovecraftian monsters, being at odds. Because the Aboleth come from a time at the very beginning. They have memories of times before the gods, and yet all of a sudden the Mind Flayers just appear. And they have no idea where the Mind Flayers come from, and that freaks them out.
Yeah.
I've actually based entire campaigns on the notion that the Aboleth and the Mind Flayers are both trying to manipulate humans and the world to their own ends, but also against each other.
Kayvon, did you read any of these backgrounds? What was kind of a favorite for you?
Did you do your homework?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks. So rather than, this is the first time it's 30 minutes in, I'm now going to speak. So kind of on the background story, what I really liked when doing the research and also just generally following them over the years is that almost all, other than the more of the recent stuff, all of the backgrounds are really just sort of told from the perspective of the people in the material plane as they try to discover like what the heck these things are that are starting to appear. So a lot of this like speculation on where they come from is exactly that. Like they're talking to other races of beings that have known them for longer that are saying like, oh no, this is their homeworld. And then they go there and they're like, oh, I don't know if that's actually the homeworld. And then they learn more information about them. And I feel like, speaking earlier on you're talking about like the mystery of them is like, rather than, at least for me, I don't like to say like, oh, they're from the future, they're from whatever. I rather sort of experience it as like it's an unknown. We don't know exactly where they're from. They haven't told anyone where they're from. They're just here now. And it's sort of this discovery of like, we don't know what they are, that we don't know exactly why they're here, what they're doing. You know, everyone is trying to figure it out, but in the meantime, they're eating our brains, and like that's the mystery of these creatures.
Absolutely.
You know?
As much as I love these backgrounds, I love the fact that there are multiple options and that none of them are 100% true.
Right. No, I think that's a big part of my enjoyment of them is just the sheer amount of mystery involved in their history and motivations. They're just so like almost unknowable. And that makes them very appealing to me. So I do have a question from chat real quick, if you guys don't mind. Black Mamba has asked if the Mind Flayers have religion. Do we know?
So that has also changed depending on who's writing them.
Okay.
They do have, or at least in some editions, they have had a couple of gods, Ilsensine and Manzacorian.
Yeah, there's some cool stories there.
In some writings, they actually worship these things. In other writings, the Mind Flayers kind of view them as, well, there are these great entities out there that might have been involved in where we came from, but we don't worship them per se.
Ari, can you pronounce that second god again?
Manzacorian?
Manzacorian, isn't he the one that also there's this cool story where like one day the Mind Flayers, they turn, because the Mind Flayers don't have a lot of priests, but the ones who do, because they're not that interested in magic usually. But they turn to him one day and he just doesn't answer and they think he's dead.
I think that was him. I think in the Dead God storyline, I think Tenebrous, which was the undead form of the demon lord Orcus, may have killed him.
Which just adds to the fear for me, because you've got these unknowable creatures who are very like bizarre and otherworldly, who seem to kind of be the high evolution of, you know, they definitely think of themselves as the highest evolution. And then they turn to a being that's potentially higher and it's just gone. And there's a mystery for them. It's like what these creatures find mysterious and scary, like freaks me out real bad. Like that's like a bad thing.
But there have been been some writings where they acknowledge these creatures exist, but don't really worship them. And I am now going to admit what I'm about to say. I actually don't remember if this is something that was written somewhere or just something I decided for my headcanon.
This might be your game.
My view of them has always been that it's almost like the view of some of Lovecraft's great old ones to the more powerful elder gods. Like some of them they acknowledge Azathoth as the great sultan at the heart of creation and chaos, but they don't worship him. They don't serve him per se. They simply acknowledge that he's out there and he's probably bigger than I am. And that's kind of how I see the Mind Flayers viewing their gods. Is that's the big mysterious guy out there right now, but someday I might be part of an elder brain that surpasses it, kind of thing.
Well, and this actually bears another quick explanation for listeners. The elder brain, the elder brain is the leader of the Mind Flayers, of a colony of Mind Flayers, and it's literally a giant brain that lives in a very pleasant sauce.
That's such
surrounded by tadpoles, which it eats.
Right, it's cannibalistic from the very beginning. And the Mind Flayers, probably their only real true religion is that they believe they don't believe when they die, the way that a Mind Flayer is kind of, they're not killed by adventurers out in the field or in one of Ari's games. They are eventually put into the elder brain pool. Their brains are removed and put there, and they believe that they then become part of the great elder brain.
Oh, it's a one of us kind of a mindset then.
Well, and my favorite thing about this is that this belief is referred to as something like the great truth or the great lie, because it is a lie. The elder brains actually absorb the knowledge and power, but they completely decimate the personality, and there's nothing like a soul that continues to be living in this thing. But they don't tell the Mind Flayers this because like all of society would collapse. It like literally all builds on this one inconvenient sort of truth.
That right there is one of the things that I'm really torn about, because I love that story and that aspect, but at the same time, it feels like it's once again getting into explaining elements of the mindset that part of me doesn't want explained. I kind of like the idea that maybe they really are just enough of a hive mind that the notion of individual survival doesn't even mean anything to them. So sometimes I treat it that way. Sometimes, though, because I do like that particular lie so much, sometimes I keep that. But that's kind of really dancing on the edge of what I was talking about, as far as the mystery.
Do you? I mean, as someone who tells stories for your career, do you find that people, like audiences in general, they tend to want like more than they should get out of? Do they always want more and more explanation? Is lore in itself sort of a is it like eating too many cookies? That like a little bit's great, but then, you eat all the cookies, bad things happen, at least to me.
I think that's one of the things about you get a really interesting character. It is absolutely human nature to want to know more about them. That's not always the best thing. There will be people who disagree with me on this, but I personally feel we didn't gain anything as far as our appreciation of Darth Vader by seeing him as an 8-year-old.
Right. No, I agree. I do 100% with that one.
I'm really curious if anybody disagrees with you on that.
Oh God, the prequels. Oh.
Kayvon, did you love Star Wars prequel? Is this?
You know what? I'm going to put a controversial opinion out there and say Star Wars in general is like all right and not something to get all crazy about. I know.
And there goes our podcast. Yep. This is our last episode, everybody. Thanks.
Cut it from the podcast. Yeah. No, I totally agree though. There's something great about mystery, as you were saying in the very beginning, and that's like the core of these creatures and the core of their lore and the core of Darth Vader is he is the core of Jaws and all the great villains. Like as soon as you start hearing the backstory of Mike Myers, it's like I don't care. Like he is an evil killer. Like Darth Vader is a dark, sinister creature with a voice. Like that's.
And again, that's not to say that cool characters or villains can never have backstory or can never have the lore expanded, but it's a question of how much is appropriate.
How far?
And there's for this particular character, this particular monster, there's no one size fits all.
You're right. I think one of the reasons that, and I mean, feel free to chime in with your own thoughts on this, but for me, one of the reasons that I think Lovecraft's literature has not only remained alive, but has continued to be written and read long past his own demise, is that we are the lore we keep searching for more lore, but they've done a good job there of kind of keeping it all somewhat, you never really do know. So the journey, the search is what really keeps us excited.
Yeah, I think to a large extent that's entirely true.
So do you think then that Dungeons and Dragons runs into this problem, like is going to come up against this problem a lot because you have DMs who want to, they feel like, I mean, the DM is sort of put in this position of like the lore here, we're going to lift we're going to open the cover and show you all the lore, all the things, because you're the DM and it's called world building and you need it to run your game, is kind of what the idea is, how it's presented. Like, do you think that is sort of creates this problem for Dungeons and Dragons where they can't leave mystery, they can't leave stones unturned? I think
that's absolutely an issue. And I wouldn't say that they can't, but it is certainly a harder and trickier and less frequent thing than you will find in novels or movies or TV shows, because you don't have a single author or small group of authors who is simply trying to entertain the audience. You have to give the DM the tools to tell their own stories. And you're also never going to get a consensus amongst the DMs on what depth of tools is sufficient. I'm sure there are quite a few DMs who would vehemently disagree with my take on the Mind Flayers. Their take, and it's a perfectly understandable take, would be, no, give me a full understanding of the Mind Flayers and I'll decide how much of it to use. I think that for a few creatures like the Mind Flayers, that's not the way to go, but I get why that's what they want. It's one of the things I really loved about the high point of Vampire the Masquerade. Even when they doled out the answers, many of them, I would say even most of them, were either given as options as opposed to this is the one way, or they were conveyed by an unreliable narrator. They were conveyed by text that was written in character.
It's been a while since I've read Gehenna, but you kind of did that in your novel, didn't you? I seem to remember that you presented a number of possibilities for how the world might end, and then we never really found out how it happened.
The ones where it was multiple possibilities was more in the game book that went along with it.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
But yeah, even in the novel, there are things where, I tried not to explain exactly how this happened or, what happened to that character that we know was dead, or that antediluvian, or, even the character Capaneus, who was written to be very heavily implied to be Cain finally returned for the end times, was never outright stated to be that.
Gotcha.
And, that's an approach that frustrates some DMs, and I understand that. And I'm not saying that everything in a game, and certainly not everything in D&D, which is a relatively straightforward game, should be that way. But I feel like there are a few creatures, and the Mind Flayer is emblematic of that, where less is more is the better approach.
And if you don't mind, I want to put this question a little bit to Kayvon and Morganite as players, because you guys have played quite a few games with me. And Kayvon, I know you've played quite a few games in general. What do you guys what do you guys feel as from the player end? Do you prefer having the lore unknown? Do you prefer figuring out everything? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so it really depends. And I think it really depends on the GM, honestly, the DM GM, because I've played games where the mystery made it a really lovely experience of just sort of not knowing what's going on, and you're kind of in the world and you know what your character knows, and that's normally not very much. And that's a good experience. But I've also played games with game masters that really created unique and really fleshed out universes of their own device. They took bits and pieces from sort of Dungeons and Dragons and other mythologies and other things and kind of created their own world. And in that, the more that they sort of slowly revealed over time, the fuller and more the richer the experience was. So it really sort of depends on if you play I wouldn't want it just to have someone sit down and tell me oh, here's what's going on all over the place behind the scenes, and this is the lore of the world. I feel like there's a sense of discovery that I personally appreciate through playing a game over a long period of time as things get slowly revealed, and based on what you're doing and who you're interacting with, it's pretty much the core of a good role-playing game.
And would you prefer to kind of leave the game feeling maybe I know some things, but not at all?
Yeah, well, you know what you've discovered, right? How much do you know in this world about everything, the ins and outs of what's going on around us on a day-to-day basis? You only know based on what you're doing, who you're interacting with.
Too much, it feels like sometimes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But that's a good point though, because it does mimic then, right? It makes the game feel more real.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Morganite?
No, I side with Kayvon here. The more you know, it can take you out of the game. Even if you end up oh yes, and see here's the detailed history of the third era of this particular. It's okay, what? Why do we need to know this? Is this necessary for our current? But the problem is finding that balance between. You don't want to go in and be here's a monster. Do we know how to fight it? No. Do we know what it is? No. What? We're in a dark room and where is it? I don't know. That makes it more difficult and less enjoyable than
makes it scary is what it makes it.
Frustrating would be where I'd put that. But there's a balance. You don't want to give away too much because then it's just you're going to put somebody to sleep with the history. And I'm sure there are some people out there who would really enjoy knowing everything, but I'm that again would take away what makes these characters so fearsome, or like the whole unknown and oh god, it's from outer space or from the future or whatever. Like that adds a level of horror that if we knew exactly, I think that would ruin it.
And Ari, I have a question for you about as a DM or just a storyteller, really. And I want to get into is it Ceramorphosis? I think it's is it Ceramorphosis, Kayvon, or is it Cetamorphosis? I always get
CERE.
Okay, it's Sarah.
You pronounce it however you
it's
feel
Sarah.
like.
I couldn't remember if it was Seta or Sarah. Sarah, science. Dungeons and Dragons science. Ceramorphosis is the process by which these things breed. And what it basically is they take a tadpole, this lovely little tiny lamprey eel looking thing.
A tadpole? Tadpole.
You know what? In my DM game, it's called Tadpool.
Okay.
That's my prerogative.
Sure. Mr. calls all the plant life foliage. Uh-huh.
And I call all the places where people are buried tomes.
Tomes.
Tomes and tombs.
Okay.
But they take these tadpoles, and they put them in your ear or by your eye, where they will then burrow under your eye, or they put them up your nose, down your throat, and these things get into your brain and slowly, well, not too slowly, and very actually over the course of just a few hours, eat your brain, insert themselves there, attach to your lower brain stem, which they leave, and then morph your body by releasing chemicals and psionics into a Mind Flayer. And that is how baby Mind Flayers are created. You basically hatch out of your own skin into an.
How long does that take? Like, do you walk around looking like yourself for a while? Is that like a function, or is it kind of a much more rapid thing?
I think they say it takes like an hour or 2 hours. It's pretty quick.
Oh God. Okay.
So when a tadpole and a victim love each other very, very much.
when a thrall and a victim.
Oh God. Wait. That's not how that works, guys.
So my question is about this is, Ari, do you think showing this in game is sort of best done through like an NPC, or do you think infecting the players with this and making it a really like front and present?
I have a thought. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
I think that's getting into the area where it really, really depends on the group and their established comfort level with more horrific aspects of the game. I would absolutely not do that to a player in a game who I didn't know very well and didn't know would be okay with it.
But would you kill that? Wait, but I feel like is that it's just a gory death, right? Like,
well,
I don't know.
No, here's the thing: it's a gory death if you basically say, okay, the character's been defeated in battle and is dragged off screen and fade to black. But get into detail. You're starting to get into areas of body horror and, to call a spade, consent, as fictionalized and as obviously fantasy as it is. It's still one of those things that some people are going to have a problem with. If you're in a group that's cool with it, then I think you can absolutely ramp up the horror of the Mind Flayer. And assuming also that you're not being, just unfair with it, the PC, never had a chance or anything. If the group's cool with it, by all means. But if not, err on the side of NPCs.
John, you have my permission to turn my character into a Mind Flayer if I did something stupid and got killed during a fight like that.
Next session. Let's see.
Yep.
Taking notes here. When I get tired of Imawaza killing player characters.
Hey, I asked if that was okay, all right?
We're all about consent here on Dungeons and Dragons. May I kill you? May I infect you with this tadpole? No, but it's a good point. I mean, it's about respect, and I also think that it's this thing that happened, and where horror used to be very psychological, and I find personally that horror has become a lot more physical in most modern fiction.
It's all about the slasher kind of horror aspect of it. Oh God, the guy's coming at me with a knife. But I think in our case, like for example, the campaign that John and I we've been in, and soon Kayvon will be too. That has always been focused on the story. And I think the only way that something like that would have happened in our campaign is that if we had a TPK and like to a Mind Flayer, and it, instead of just being like, oh, y'all are dead, like it would make sense at that point to have the Mind Flayer go and drag one of us off and dump us in a pool for the tadpole to the tadpole to infect our brain. And I mean, that would just have been such a cool way to wrap up that type of a TPK for sure. Instead of just like, and you're all dead, it would have felt more meaningful.
For the group that's cool with it, absolutely. I am all for that kind of visceral horror.
And do you think that body horror is a big part of the Mind Flayer? Am I wrong on that, Ari? I mean,
very much so. Yeah.
I mean, tentacles. Yeah.
And just to get kind of deep delve into these things, like, I mean, it's sort of one of the things I find crazy about early D&D. Now, you've been playing for a long time, right, Ari?
Yeah, I started in...
He had to think about it, so that's a yes.
So one of the things that always amazed me about early D&D is I remember as a kid, I didn't play, but I read the monster manuals. And I have these vivid memories of all these stories and all these back things. And like, I remember like that the Mind Flayer was this creature of intense like body horror. And then doing the research for this podcast, I went back and reread the first Monster Manual where I first read about Mind Flayers. And it's like a paragraph. It's like, there are these things that have tentacles, and then here's a bunch of stats because I'm Gary Gygax. And then here's, it has Mind Blast. That was
absolutely it. All this background stuff, all the horror stuff. It came from it came from supplements like in Dragon Magazine, and then got folded into second edition, which built on it with the Monster Manual or Monsters Compendium there and the Ilithiad.
But what I'm kind of wondering is like, I feel like they were able to. I think I created a lot of that body horror. I think I created it in my mind before I ever read the Illithid or any of that stuff. But they were able to create that feeling with very simple descriptions of these monsters.
I think once you have a monster that eats brains with tentacles and has psionic powers,
but
that's assuming that you could ignore the first edition Monster Manual artwork. The Mind Flayers in the first edition Monster Manual was Zoidberg.
Oh no!
You're so right.
Wait, but Zoidberg has like claw hands. Do Mind Flayers?
Go to Mind Flayer first edition. Like just look up Mind Flayer first edition, and you'll see. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Okay, the hands are different. I'll give you that. But other than that,
we've had a couple questions in chat regarding the capabilities of Mind Flayers. A couple of them have had to do with the feeding aspect. We know they eat brains, but what exactly do they get out of it? It's not just like a Happy Meal. It's like they absorb the person's experiences.
It's a Happy Meal with a toy.
It is primarily nutrition, but I think in at least some of the editions, they can also actually gain some knowledge from it.
Yeah.
You got to remember that they're eating psionic energy as well. Were you going to go off on that, Kayvon?
Yeah. So in some of the descriptions within the editions, they talk about them experiencing euphoria as they devour the brains, along with memories, personality, and one of them says innermost fears. So it's they definitely are getting a treat. And like on just for like some stats, they have to eat a brain a month. For people who are curious.
Oh, okay.
Or else they lose their abilities. And there was actually something which I read in one place and then I couldn't find it anywhere else. But it was saying that when they eat the brains, they secrete a thin like mucus over their bodies and over their skin. And it's that thin mucus that actually provides their magic resistance. Like, so if they start losing, if they don't eat enough brains and they start getting weak, they lose some of that magic resistance. So there's something there. I know every so often we talk about like, oh, what can we make out of them?
Rugs.
And there is potentially some like recipe, there's like some recipe there for like a magic resistance potion or something like that, collecting the mucus from their skin. I don't know. I got it. I enjoyed that little bit of detail there.
If you're making a magic potion from the Mind Flayer mucus, that's kind of like cannibalism once removed, isn't it?
Ooh, it would be if we come from, or if Mind Flayers come from us. That's okay. Yep. Mm.
Oh yeah. Oh man.
Yep.
See, the horror continues.
Well, because most player characters or even like characters in game would not know that. Like, I mean, how frequently do you see a Mind Flayer? Also, where do these tadpoles come from?
They produce them themselves.
Okay.
I think they one place said they produced 2 in their lifetime. They're hermaphroditic creatures.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's literally called a clutch. Like they lay a clutch of these things,
Okay.
which the imagery there, no matter how you decide to describe that as a DM, I could see many people just being like, and it lays a clutch and just moving on because there's no pleasant way to describe that.
Hold on. When you say a clutch, are you referring to multiple? Because I read that it was, they produced 1 like twice in their life. Have you found elsewhere where they say they produce like a grip of it?
In the Alethiad, it insinuates that it's a number of eggs because there are in a pool like thousands of these things.
Yeah, but the pools are like they're all pouring into the same pool, right?
Yeah, but
well, maybe we're different editions.
But I've got it right here. The Illithids deposit.
John has the definitive version right here.
So the hermaphroditic Mind Flayer. This is from literally page 10 of the Ilithiad, which I love the fact that they base it on the Iliad. That's amazing. They literally, just a side note, they literally reference here another book on Mind Flayers that's not written, but should be, called Mind Kampf.
No.
I just...
No. Oh, gosh.
The hermaphroditic Mind Flayer spawns... I'll do it in my Attenborough voice. The hermaphroditic Mind Flayer spawns twice during its entire life, depositing a gooey clutch of clear eggs measuring 1/6 of an inch in diameter each. Each clutch contains approximately 1,000 eggs, all bound together by a sticky mass of illithid mucus. And so they deposit these egg clutches along the moist inner edge of the elder-brained pool. Of the I keep saying that. Of the tadpoles in a clutch, most do not survive to maturity. Only 1 in 1,000 survive.
So essentially 2. John had to go and give us all that information, Kayvon, just to...
No, it's nice. I think that what I was reading is that they once or twice in their life lay this clutch is maybe the misread on my end.
I haven't done the math, so I could be wrong here, but 1/6 of an inch, 1,000 of them from a roughly human-sized humanoid body. I'm having issues.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the clutch. I think the eggs measure 1/6 of an inch. And then 1,000 of them.
Yeah, but what's the width? Because we have like miles of intestine in our body, right? Or like we have. If we stretch out our veins, they run around the circumference of the earth.
Birth your Illithiad clutch out of your intestines. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, and I have a little bit.
Like we have the space.
I have a bit of lore. I have a little bit of lore for everybody here. In the Forgotten Realms, this is where the phrase "better out than in" comes from.
Oh no! So bad.
At the very least, we're talking about a fairly long process. You ought to bring a book or something.
I usually do.
We only do this twice in our life because it's a 13-week labor.
There's
Inevitability of Justice just did the math, and he said approximately 14 square feet.
I don't think he did the math. I don't think he actually.
I'm sorry, 14 what?
Square feet.
Well, they are big pools, right? These are big elder.
No, but you have no. Where are you going to keep that in your body? Do we have access to hammer space again? What? I am crying right now. Oh,
and there's
God.
nothing that kills horror faster than math. If you just picture any scary movie, think of The Shining. The twins come around the corner and they go, 1,000 eggs at 1/6 of a square inch forever.
It gets weird, guys.
The mood is gone. The mood is gone.
Oh, God. I just pulled a rib muscle thing.
Just a side note here. Our math was totally wrong. Thanks to Rick Spore on Facebook, who corrected us. He says, it's fairly simple. Each egg is a sphere, 1/6 of an inch in diameter, meaning its radius is 1/12 of an inch. Volume of a sphere is... Okay, well, he goes off on a bunch of stuff that I'm not good at math, so I don't understand. But he basically comes up with the perfectly reasonable conclusion that each clutch is about 4 cubic inches in real life, not anywhere near our 14 feet. But it is funny.
Oh, God. Okay, so another question is, so they have psionic psychic abilities, which some people claim is a type of magic, or it's a completely different field all its own. But we had somebody asking that do they like to use minions, or do they do their own fighting?
Oh God, it's minions all the way.
Minions all the way. Mm-hmm.
They have all kinds of thralls.
How complete thralldom are we talking about here? Like, is this like low grade zombie functionality, or are they like still fully functional, just completely mentally taken over?
Okay, so I am now once again having trouble remembering the line between what I've read versus what I've made up. But I seem to recall they have both. That there are some servants that are basically just sort of, I'm still me, but I'm dominated to be loyal to the Mind Flayers.
Okay.
Versus I'm basically a hollow, drooling shell that they use like a puppet.
They have 3 kinds of thralls. They actually, well, one is not really a thrall. They do work with some minions.
Yeah.
And there are creatures that the Mind Flayers cannot get into their brains. And this actually answers another question. Amy Chibi asked, what does a Mind Flayer fear? And they fear the undead. Quite terribly fear the undead. More than any other creature on this plane of existence, Mind Flayers are terrified of the undead because, one, they are cold, and Mind Flayers see in infrared.
Oh, okay.
So they're like invisible zombies. Just picture that. That's horrible. 2, they can't do anything with their minds. And Mind Flayers, like that is their interaction with the world, is completely based around being able to read minds. And if they can't read a mind, getting pushback on it and being, oh, this is a psionic creature, and then evaluating it based off that. The undead have no minds. So even the living, they even talk about this, like vampires, they're immune to psychic attack. So to them, they are invisible, non-understandable. They are abominations that terrify the Mind Flayers, and probably the greatest threat to them is undead. So there are creatures that they work with, though, who they don't prefer to take over, or whose minds they don't find suitable for takeover. Like I think the Kua Tau? They don't take their minds over. They'll sometimes eat them for fun, but they tend to work together with them. And then the rest, the thralldom, depends on how much they were resisted. If they were resisted a lot, they will blast the mind, like sand blasting a soup cracker, and then there's not much left after that.
What? Why would you sandblast a soup cracker?
You've never done that? It's the best way to get it into the perfect size chunks for your chicken soup. Every kitchen should come equipped.
I don't trust anything in your kitchen anymore.
Amy Chibi also asks a really interesting question that I actually want to throw to you, Ari. What would a Mind Flayer think about Cthulhu and the cult behind him?
So I have actually been tempted in a couple of games to link the two. I have thought about, but never actually done, never actually brought in the actual Lovecraft mythos to a D&D game. And if I did, they would almost have to be linked in my mind. I think if I were to do that, I might actually even make Ilsensin, the Mind Flayer god, another name for Cthulhu. But if one weren't going to go that route, then I would probably see them as rivals, the same way that the Mind Flayers and the Aboleth struggle.
Yeah.
The Mind Flayers basically, if they can't use it or control it, it's an enemy. So yeah, either I would connect them, or I would put them at odds with Ilsensin being basically a rival of Cthulhu. As far as the cultists, I think they would probably put them in the same category as their own minions. These are the weak, feeble puppets that either we use or they use, and they're disposable cannon fodder and food.
And do you think? I mean, is one of the things that I wonder if people find scary about the Mind Flayers? I'd love to get all of your opinions on this. Is that they just might be the superior beings. Like, they definitely believe they are. But if you look at them, like, they actually, especially with this idea that maybe they come from our future or a future, they could be the ultimate evolution. And that's even maybe hinted at by the fact that, they kind of evolve out of us. They put this parasite in us, and then we become them. And I don't even think they would think of that as an evil act. I think they might even think of it as a great gift given to the ones they choose. Kayvon, what do you think about that? I mean, is that part of what makes this scary?
Yeah. So I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, just because there's something I want to talk about, which kind of goes into this a little bit.
We don't want to hear about your life right now.
It's all right. I have something to share, and now I have a microphone. I feel like they themselves are also thralls. In the same way that we are thralls, they just happen to be thralls in control. And there's something which isn't explicitly said, but is kind of touched upon when you read a lot about them, which is like their life cycle. They start off as these little tadpoles. They grow, and they effectively, the Mind Flayers, the tentacly that we identify as Mind Flayers, will take the tadpoles and insert them into a brain of a creature in order to reproduce themselves, which are these sort of like Mind Flayer creatures, which you're describing as like the next evolution. But if you actually let the tadpole evolve on its own without interrupting that process, it becomes this like epic worm neolithid, I think is what they call it. And it's
neolithid.
Neolithid, and it's this insanely huge worm, which like the Mind Flayers fear because it eats them like it eats everything else. And I feel like the Mind Flayers were probably more, at least in my understanding of the lore and like what I think probably happened, they were probably an accident. Like they were a creature in whatever world they came from that got interrupted by this little one of the tadpoles ate one of these creatures, became this sentient being, which is then all of a sudden now in the process of reproducing itself through these tadpoles and interrupting the actual creature, which is this like insane worm creature, from ever fully developing. So it's sort of this weird like symbiotic relationship it has with like its source of power, which is the tadpole, and its own, what turned it into a thrall. And it basically like propagates itself in this larval state over and over and over again, never fully letting like the source fully develop, which I think is kind of cool. And I think I would expect to have been delved into more within the lore, and it doesn't. It just sort of briefly mentions, at least in what I've been able to find, this evolved form.
It does say in the Lithiad that they themselves do not know much about the Neolithid creature. It actually mentions like that it's as mysterious to them as it is to us. And
I feel like somewhere in the line they got corrupted and are themselves thralls of this greater creature.
Taking notes for a future campaign now.
Right?
Oh, good.
I want to get to our kind of our last round of questions here. And there's one that there's one that actually has been asked of Ari on the chat. Black Mamba says there was a lore that said the reason why Mind Flayers consume brains is because the elder brain is looking for the answer to a specific question.
Oh.
Have you ever heard of that, or do you know of that?
42.
I had not heard that, but I really like that, especially because, to bring this back around to where we started, that's the kind of motivation that I can get my head around, and yet not knowing what the question is,
right,
doesn't innately weaken the alienness or the mystery of the Mind Flayers. I really like that idea. But no, I had never actually read that or heard that before.
And I have a question for you from my own list that I was thinking going into this. I keep mentioning it, but I am really reading and enjoying Ash and Ambition. And one of the things that I've noticed in your writing, and I kind of remember this from Gehenna too, was that you actually imbue quite a lot of humor into your stories.
I'm sorry, you dropped out there.
Oh, you just want me to want me to praise you again?
He just wants to
hear it a second time. I said that you imbue your stories with a lot of humor.
Yes.
And which is appreciated. And so I have to ask you the question, how would you make the Mind Flayer funny? Aside from making him look like Zoidberg. Do you think you could do, I mean, do you think you could maintain, I guess what I'm asking is not just make him ridiculous and goofy, but like, do you think you could have a Mind Flayer in a campaign that retained all of its qualities, was still the brain eating, thing that it was, still that was its goal, but you could add a bit of twist of dark humor on it?
It would certainly be tricky. I think most of the humor would have to come from the characters dealing with it, but I think there are ways you could do it. It would have to be very minimal, because anything more than just a couple of touches of it would ruin the horror aspect. I mean, I like mixing humor and horror, but it's a really difficult balance, and with the Mind Flayers especially. But I think if you were very careful, you could get some humor out of the fact that you never really know exactly why they're doing what they're doing if their motivations are alien. You can have one do something completely out of left field in the middle of an otherwise relatively straightforward, dark section of action, which you could get sort of a what the fuck level humor from that.
Oh, yeah.
If you play with the idea that I mentioned earlier of the Mind Flayers, absorbing emotion and forcing people to do stuff.
Oh, yeah.
My example, they were doing some really horrific stuff, but you could also have somebody forced to do something was just way out there.
I like that it's kind of what comes to my mind after you're talking about this is a Mind Flayer that then joins the party as an NPC. And players just keep waking up with it like cradling their heads in its hands. Just like, but it never does anything. It never eats their brains, and they don't know why. And what it's really feeding off of is all of their stupid decisions.
There you go. Well, is it, we've discussed multiple times that they feed off of brains and psychic energy and that kind of thing. So if they have a whole bunch of thralls, can they feed off of their own thralls, or is there nothing there left to consume? No,
they can eat them. The brain doesn't have to be have personality left. It can.
Okay.
They it's just the brain matter itself.
It's okay.
They also will sometimes eat their thralls. Like they'll turn people to slaves, have them do things like build build their temples and then eat them afterwards?
There's no hard and fast rule for that, but I have seen in some of the lore the idea that on very rare occasions, after a Mind Flayer has turned another person into a Mind Flayer, the Mind Flayer might temporarily keep a few personality quirks. So that would imply that it could be done.
That seems like it'd be a good Independence Day, like send in someone with some sort of mental illness or some sort of
Jesus,
psychic harm. I'm just saying, like a Trojan horse. Like you send you intentionally infect some sort of mental sickness into somebody, and then send them in to be devoured in order to pass that sickness into the hive mind.
The answer to that is the answer to that's no, though. I mean, we see this in the lore. Like they can eat their thralls. And it doesn't, I mean, these can be mindless creatures or creatures that they've zapped most of the personality out of. Like even a damaged brain, it's still meat. Think about that. Like when you eat, like, yeah, you can eat meat, a bad steak and get sick if it's been poisoned or something. But the personality of the cow, like you don't eat it and you're like, oh my God, I really, that was a dumb cow. So it's kind of like that. You got to think it is a food source, a protein source.
Well, I don't know. If you're absorbing the cow's memories, it might bother you.
Well, there is that. There is psionically, they can overload. They can overload psionically.
Well, I think that's where the questions were going from.
The other thing I was going to say, as far as a way to make a Mind Flayer funny, and this would only work once, if you have the Mind Flayer communicating with the party, whether it's directly or my idea of, through thralls or whatnot, and for whatever reason, it's not a hostile interaction, maybe the Mind Flayer thinks that the PCs can accomplish something for it. I really like the idea of this completely alien creature, has no idea, well, not no idea, but doesn't truly understand how human emotions work. But in the past, it observed somebody putting an audience at ease with a joke. So you have this Mind Flayer, telepathic communication or speaking through its thralls, and it opens the conversation with this completely unrelated, irrelevant attempt at a joke. And I think if that was done right, the reaction to it could definitely be a source of humor. Well, that being said, Mind Flayers, they're really cool. They're great mastermind villains, but over the course of the different editions, they've tended to average at fairly mid-range challenge ratings.
Well, and the CRs are always a little bit misleading, but if you look at like the numbers of what they have in 5th edition, it's not that hard to hit them. I think their AC is pretty low. And their health isn't that great. It's like 79 hit points.
No, I do think a large number of the early 5e monsters are underrated. But even if we, or underpowered, rather.
I will say some advice to 5th edition DMs if you want to use the Mind Flayer. A couple tidbits of advice. One, 5th edition's very much based on hordes. As Ari pointed out early on in the podcast, there's a lot of reasons for Mind Flayers to have hordes of thralls around them. I would really recommend, if you're going to use a Mind Flayer as a monster, have him constantly using his Misty Step or Planar Shift or whatever to kind of get in and out of the battle, to stay in the back.
Throwing sonic powers from the back while his thralls are taking all the damage. Absolutely.
The other thing you can do is, if you really want to make a Mind Flayer that's a bit more of a central villain, I highly recommend using the class rules and give him some levels. Give him levels in Sorcerer until he bumps his DCs, his difficulty challenges up to like 17 or even 19, where it becomes much harder to block his Mind Blast. And he's got some extra spells and some extra hit points, maybe some special magic items, things like that. Remember that, the Mind Flayer that's sitting there is just a template. Think of that as the peasant Mind Flayer, the citizen Mind Flayer.
Didn't you almost dissolve my character with a Mind Flayer?
Well, this kind of takes me to my very final question, which is which is great uses of Mind Flayers in your games. And we did have a really fun one. Our Mind Flayer was very much embracing of the Spelljammer aspect and was literally like a Space Marine Mind Flayer.
You're going to get me started, and we're close to the end. But Spelljammer is, and I like a lot of aspects of the setting. But Spelljammer is one of my biggest offenders as far as my humanizing the Mind Flayers too much.
Yeah, it does really. It makes them more of a common creature.
That was an aside. Sorry, you'll go ahead with your story there.
No. I won't spoil it. It'll eventually show up on our Alignment May Vary podcast.
Yep, on our radio play. We're several seasons away from our Mind Flayer, but we'll get there.
But no, that I was just pointing that out as a quick example. I really wanted to hear, Ari, if you have a great Mind Flayer story, like your first encounter with one or your favorite encounter with one.
The entire campaign was based on the idea that most of the world was covered in basically like a permanent storm. I actually stole this idea from was it Zeb Cook? I don't know, one of the old TSR guys. Most of the world was covered in a supernatural storm, and all the communities were on the mountaintops above. One of the very traditional Mind Flayer plots is that they want to blot out the sun so they can come above ground and control everything. And I had them doing that, and I had the Aboleth trying to flood the world. And these two major world-altering schemes of theirs had come to fruition at the same time and messed each other up and caused this permanent storm. The discovery of that and having to find a way to basically play these two forces against each other that were enemies but had kind of pulled back to their own corners to try to end the ongoing effect was something that I did. And then, of course, there was that encounter I mentioned to you earlier with the Mind Flayers floating above the orgy of violence, just absorbing the.
That's such a cool scene. I mean, it's horrible, but that's part of it.
That was the scene where I introduced that particular group to my concept of Mind Flayers, and I don't want to say it went over well, but it was effective.
Well, Kayvon Morganite, do you have any final questions or words on trivia on the Mind Flayer?
Okay, there's a couple of things I want to cover real fast. So there's early talk, and this came from the Dragon Magazine 78. So this is like early 80s.
Are you talking the ecology of the Mind Flayer?
They talk about extreme sunlight sensitivity, and they say like a light spell, even like a magical light spell is enough to make them go into like blind spasms and effectively become helpless. I didn't see anywhere where they've removed this, but I'm assuming they did. Because that seems like a huge weakness that could so easily be taken advantage of in any sort of combat.
Yeah.
This sort of like intolerance to any sort of light.
Everything I've seen since then has said that they don't like sunlight, but it doesn't cause them any immediate harm or distress.
And this was part of the ecology articles. The ecology articles would often, like part of their appeal back in the day was that they were not just fantasy like articles, but they were also adding rules. Like that was a rule of TSR when they used to publish early on, was that anything published in their Dragon magazine had to in some way incorporate a new rule. Like they felt like that was the selling point for their gamers, was it had to be a rule. So all of the ecology episodes, like they usually have those footnotes.
Uh-huh.
And there's always new rules in them. Like, hey, with owlbears, there was something about hearing. And with flumps, there was all sorts of extra little bits. Like, even if it's what you can make out of them, there's always a rule. And I think they threw in that rule for the Mind Flayer, but I think it was just a reason to keep them underground.
Yeah, okay, because I haven't seen it repeated anywhere else other than this one Dragon magazine article. But it's a pretty great rule. I don't know. Like, I guess it's up to the GM how they want to play it. But that's
basic light spell.
Yeah, I'm just like, okay, I'm not too concerned about this guy.
Well, cantrip.
Yeah, exactly. What else was good? They talk about, there was an interesting thing that I saw. Let me see where this one was. This one was in Dragon Magazine 150, so a little bit later on.
Oh, cool.
They were talking about the Illithid embrace. So they were seen in, like, this is again the Dragon Magazine, so it's like someone telling a story about like what they witnessed out in the wild, this sort of thing. But they were saying that they sometimes, when they meet, they'll clasp their feeding tentacles together in like some sort of like handshake, like Mind Flayer handshake.
Wait, they have
that
specific tentacles for feeding? Hang on, no. Okay,
no. It's the same tentacles.
Okay.
It's the same tentacles. Yeah, they refer to them and they quote them as feeding tentacles in the article because the person's telling a story, but that's what they refer to them as. They clasp their tentacles together in like some sort of handshake, which I thought was kind of cool. Like you see a bunch of like, you're like scoping out Mind Flayers and they have like a little, secret handshake thing they do. That was kind of a cool little detail.
That would make it difficult to use like a disguise self spell to pretend to be one.
Yeah, they call it the sly five. They sneak each other a little sly five, and that's how they know it's one of you. That's funny.
I think that was in the Sunset World article, in case anyone's trying to look it up.
I mean, Mind Flayers are a huge topic. I mean, there's so much to cover. There's the GIF, the Githyanki.
Yeah.
We'll save that for those races. There's all sorts of thralls and special kind of monsters that are attached to them, like the Intellect Devourers, the Neolithids, the Elder Brains. Which, does anybody else think the Elder Brain like directly influenced Metroid? Can I just throw that out there?
Probably.
I mean, Mother Brain.
Yeah, that's
in a
real
jar.
similar. Yeah.
I don't know. Every time I see a picture of the Elder Brain, I'm like, and okay, it's the Z bites. But there's just so much trivia and lore to this that I kind of find it. I really dug the fact that where our conversation went was really talking about, less makes more,
and how to actually use them in a campaign and experience them rather than just sort of the facts of their lives.
Yeah. And I do wonder, if that in itself really is kind of the true horror, is not having the reason, not knowing why these terrible things are happening, and just being told, well, this is for your own good.
There's a reason why the fear of the unknown is a thing.
Because it might burst out through your skull in a tentacled face. That's the fear of the unknown is very healthy.
The more you know.
Ari, do you have any last words or anything else you wanted to share?
I think we've covered it fairly well. I think that anything else I want to bring up would spawn an entirely new tangent of conversation. I think I'll say I'm done.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you for
the invite.
For leading us in. And maybe sometime in the future, if you want to tackle another creature, we'd be happy to have you back.
Okay, sounds good.
When is our Aboleth episode coming up?
October 6th is the live stream of the episode, and I'm not sure how soon after that you'll have the podcast version up. But yeah, October. And our guest for our next episode is going to be Ellieface, who's a streamer friend of ours, who I'm going to shout out down below here. She has her own D&D campaigns, and so we reached out and thought it would be kind of cool to have another D&D Twitch streamer on board. So.
Awesome. And I will give one final shout out to Ash and Ambition. It is a book about a dragon who has taken on the form of the knight who killed him, and now has to get involved in like politics and human interactions, and has a little goblin companion that follows him around. It is a wonderful mix of both very funny, but actually very, the funny doesn't break the world. Like it never gets goofy or to the point where you're feeling like, okay, this is outside of this world. It's a very good story with just characters that you fall in love with very quickly. And a really cool twist on fantasy. I haven't seen this really done this way before. So that's Ash and Ambition. Very highly recommend you pick it up. So with that, we'll let everybody get to their night. So thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time.
Later.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.